EMP series, The Exodus, journal entry number 5. This morning we got an early start. We wanted to try to reach the town where Carl's friend was last known to be living. Our hope was to make contact with him today, if possible. Janet, the young refugee who joined us yesterday with her 2 children, was, come to find out, in her 4th year of medical school when the EMP attack happened. She was getting to know the group and seemed like she would fit nicely. Carl, Greg, and myself hiked to the top of the ridgeline yesterday afternoon to try to get a look at the area. Steve had been an avid hiker before the EMP attack, and he had hiked the complete Appalachian Trail from Springer Mountain, Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine several times. When he was young, he hiked it through in 6 months, starting in Georgia in mid-February and ending up at the summit of Katahdin at the end of August, hiking several sections more than once over the years. One of his favorite hikes was the Long Trail in Vermont. The Long Trail was roughly 280 miles long, starting in Mass near the Vermont border and terminating at the Vermont-Canadian border. 100 miles of that trail coincides with the Appalachian Trail. The Long Trail is some of the most beautiful and physically rigorous hiking along the AT. It traverses through the Green Mountains and reaches Vermont's highest peak, Mount Mansfield, at one point. Before Steve was murdered by Rico Carollo, he had been an advocate of using the AT as an escape route if needed during a bug-out scenario. He had provided extensive topographical mapping of the area, including handwritten notes and side routes that he had taken during his time on the trail. While on our hike today, we were looking for a trail that connected this area of New York across the border into Vermont and onto the trail. Carl had been largely against using the AT during a bug-out because he believed that it would be a major thoroughfare in those hard times, and therefore would not be the safest route. As a group, we decided that it should be considered as a contingency for a backup route. The entire group was briefed on the contingency and was aware of the locations of access points along the way. Now that we traveled north in New York, we were in proximity to it. In southern Vermont, the AT ran almost parallel and just to the west of Route 7. At Killington Mountain, the main trail veered west and eventually crossed into New Hampshire and then Maine. The Long Trail system continues away from the AT trail at Killington going north to the Canadian border. I remember Steve telling us about one of his hikes through there on a cold, freezing, rainy day. They descended into a valley near the town of Johnston and came on a large field owned by the Long Trail Tavern. The man who owned the place was hiker-friendly and let people set up their tents in his field. Steve and his group came down, soaking wet, freezing cold. They went in to eat at the tavern and ended up sitting in front of the wood stove all day. The owner let them set up a clothesline over the stove to dry all their gear out. That night, it poured rain and was in the high 30s and windy. After getting to know the tavern owner, he let them set up their tents on the back porch to get out of the weather as much as possible. Steve and his group remained friends with him and stayed in touch ever since. Steve recounted his days on the trail fondly and noted that he had forged many lifelong friendships from his time hiking. I wonder now what became of that man and the tavern Steve remembered fondly. Was he still there? Was he surviving these hard times? Or had he been a victim of the societal collapse that followed the EMP attack, as Steve himself had been? Often, we took the simple things in life for granted before. The sense of community and the willingness of others, strangers even, to help one another, as that tavern owner had done for Steve and his group on that cold, rainy day. People weren't always on guard with each other. They weren't always suspicious of every human encounter, as they now have to be. Nobody ever would think twice about pulling into a small town like this one, stopping at a convenience store to gas up or buy some basic supplies. We would go in and often encounter numerous strangers and not think twice about it. It's different now. Every step, every move must be carefully measured and planned out. Danger and even death were potentially lurking around every corner. With all the death and destruction, with all the suffering and pain, it was easy to see how one could become guarded, how one could become callous and hardened to others. I was seeing this happen in Carl. The death of his sons caused a change in him. It flipped a switch that I'm not sure could ever be reset. He functions still, almost mechanically, automatically. But there is an emptiness inside him, inside his soul. I see it when I look into his eyes. The passion, the compassion, seem to be faded to near non-existence now. I see the way Abigail and her daughters love him. If anything can pull him back from the precipice which he now balances on, it will be them and the love that they have for him. It is his last hold on his humanity. Greg is very protective of Carl. He is a good friend to him in this terrible time. He tries his best not to let anyone see how damaged Carl really is. He keeps most people at arm's length of him. They have been through so much together. They share a brotherhood that has truly been forged in fire. The bus meandered along the backcountry road. The city we were heading for, or what would be left of it, was a few miles ahead. Carl had nothing more to go on than an address from a letter he received from his friend 3 years earlier. Greg announced, "We have a problem," and we looked forward, out the window, to see an armed roadblock. It was 2 World War II-era jeeps with 4 armed men standing with rifles at the low-ready position. One of them was waving for the bus to pull over onto a dirt lot just off the road. Carl, standing at the front of the bus now behind Greg, said, "Looks like regular army to me." Greg chimed in, "Yeah, all the fatigues match. All the same weapons platforms. Look over there." He pointed to a man emerging from behind a fortified outpost. He was wearing captain's bars and was directing the men about. I saw the airborne insignia pinned to his shirt and placed my hand on Carl's shoulder. "Chief, can I handle this? You and Greg are both wanted by the military authorities, and they most likely have paperwork on you both." Carl looked over at me as he considered what I was saying. "This may be our best shot, our only shot. Let me try, Chief," I said again. Carl nodded. Greg cocked the hammer back in the .45 he kept in a pouch mounted to the bus wall under the sliding window. As I exited the bus, Carl told him, "Easy, Greg, stand easy." Carl himself, glancing over at the AR-15 rifle in its cradle behind the driver's seat. He nonchalantly reached over and unclipped the retention strap that secured it to the cradle and slowly pulled his hand back. He made eye contact with Greg, who just nodded at him silently, letting him know he was on board and ready to back him up. I walked over to the captain, and 2 of the armed men racked the slides back on their rifles and pointed them at me. The captain ordered, "Stop! Who told you to get off the bus?" he demanded. I paused and looked at the captain. Nobody told me I couldn't get off the bus. I'm sorry, sir. I just had to stretch my legs. I'll get back on board. As I turned to walk away, the captain yelled, "Stop! Let me see your ID, cowboy." I turned and gave him my paperwork. As he looked it over, I motioned to the insignia on his shirt and said, "Airborne, eh?" The captain looked at me. I motioned toward my coat and asked, "Mind if I reach in and grab a cigar?" The captain paused and said, "Go ahead," as he motioned his men that it was okay. He handed the paperwork off to one of his men and told him to run the name and info. I offered the captain a cigar, which he took. As we stood there smoking, I tried to engage him in conversation about his time in service in an attempt to form a bond. "So, when did you serve?" I asked him. He told me he served with the 75th in the Persian Gulf. Then he looked at me and asked, "Did you serve?" I rolled up my sleeve and showed him the tat. "Served with the 101st in Vietnam. I landed in 67 in Quang Tri. Came home in 70. He took a long drag off his cigar. "I'm sorry for the way you boys got treated when you came back. That was inexcusable. I'm ashamed of this country for that failure." I looked over at him. "It was a different time. A tough time." "Yeah," he said. "It still sucks, though." I nodded at him. Then he motioned toward the bus. "Who you riding with there?" I told him they were just a church group that I was with, that our homes were looted and we were burnt out, that we were trying to get up north to a friend's farm. The perfect balance of truth and fiction, I couldn't help thinking. Then I told another lie. "I'm trying to hook up with my godson. He lives up in Essex. Haven't heard from him in 3 years, before the EMP attack." The captain looked down at the ground and back up at me. "Essex, huh? That's not good. That area had been hit pretty hard. Right after the attack, the whole area around the lake was devastated. Took a couple weeks for the gangs to make their way up from the Albany area. They left a path of destruction in their wake. When help tried to come in from Burlington, Vermont, they sunk the ferry." Then he looked around and back at me. "This whole area went to crap. If your godson was there, he's most likely gone. Some got out, but most killed. That's the problem with these small villages. They didn't have the people or the resources to defend themselves against the large bands of marauders. They just swept through. It was ugly. By the time we got reorganized and mobilized out here, it was all pretty much over. We brought the remaining gangs back into order, but the damage had already been done. I'm sorry, Roger, but I don't hold out much hope for your guy." "Well," I said, "he's a pretty capable survivor. He might have done okay." The captain replied, "I hope so. But I can tell you one thing, he ain't in Essex. I promise you that. Wouldn't have any idea where he would have went off to." Then he looked over at the armed trooper that was standing outside the bus door, making sure the others stayed on board. "What about the rest of your crew? Church members, you say. They carrying any weapons?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "In this new world we find ourselves in, we'd all be dead if we weren't. They're civilians, though, Cap. I tried to teach them the basics, but I wouldn't want to go into battle with them." The captain just looked at me for a minute. "I have been in battle with them, and would go again in a moment without hesitation if the need arose. But I didn't want to tell him that. We're just trying to get to safe haven up north," I finally said. The captain walked over and looked into the bus, at Greg, and then at Carl. He nodded. They each nodded back without speaking. The captain turned to me and said, "Okay, Ranger, if I was to run the ID of everyone on board, you think anything interesting would come back?" I chuckled and answered, "Define interesting, Cap." I chuckled again. "Nah, just a group from church. Civilians fleeing a crap situation down south. Although, by the way that one drives," nodding at Greg, "wouldn't surprise me if he had a glove compartment filled with unpaid traffic violations." The captain chuckled and walked on to the bus. He looked around and spotted the AR-15 mounted to the back of the driver's seat. He looked at me, and I told him it was mine. There were no other weapons visible. He looked down the aisle, stopping at the women and children. He made eye contact with Carl and Abigail's youngest daughter. "Honey, where are y'all headed in this big bus?" he asked. She looked up at him and answered, "We are going to a farm up near Canada. A friend of my daddy lives there, and he said we could all stay there with him. It's a really nice place. He's a preacher at a church up there." Abigail put her arm around her daughter's shoulder. The captain fixed his stare on them for a moment before scanning the rest of the group. Then he walked back out and stood before me. "Roger, in order to let your group through to Essex, I gotta see paper on every member of your group." We stood there opposite each other for a tense moment. "But as I told you, nobody's left there anyway, so there's really no reason for y'all to go down into the village?" Then he handed my ID papers back to me and said, "You're good to go. Best thing for you to do right now would be to turn that bus around. Head back in the direction you came from. If you follow 22 down till you hit Route 4, you can take it east, across the border into Vermont. When you hit 7, head north." I nodded as I took my papers back. Then the captain said, "Ranger, you probably will come across more checkpoints like this one along the way. I know for certain there's one on the border at Route 4. Probably others once you cross over. But it's most likely clear from here to the border." Roger nodded and said, "Thanks, Cap." Then as I began to walk away, he asked me, "Hey, Ranger, were you in country during the Tet Offensive back in '68? I stopped and looked at him. "Yeah, I was in Long Bin. Saw enough of it." Then he said, "Yeah, my uncle was a Marine MP at the embassy in Saigon at the time. He didn't make it out." "I'm sorry to hear that, Cap. Those embassy boys saw the worst of it that night, no question. But they took a heck of a lot of the VC with them." Then the captain paused and said, "Yeah, never made it home." Then he chuckled. "In a way, I guess that was a good thing. It would have killed them, the way you boys got greeted when you came back. Go over there to do a job, the job you were ordered to do. Just soldiers following orders, like any good soldier should and would. Then to come back to that, to an ungrateful nation." He paused again. "Makes me sick." Then, in one truly honest moment, I felt myself starting to tear up as I remembered that time. I looked at the captain and told him, "Yeah, messed me up for quite some time too, but I survived, unlike so many I knew. So many good men, just, as you say, doing their jobs. It was a messed up time in this nation's history, but you know, Cap, I feel like it's changing. I feel like people are starting to see. They're starting to get it." "Yeah, I suppose so," the captain said. "Better 50 years late than never." Then I said, "History will tell the whole story, Cap. We got bigger problems as a nation now." He nodded. But not today, we don't, Ranger. You just steer clear of them roadblocks. I wish you the best of luck getting your group up north." Then he snapped a salute and said, "Get out of here." I returned the salute and boarded the bus. I looked at Greg. "Turn us around and get us gone, Greg." He fired up the old bus and proceeded back the way we came. I'd like to thank everybody here for watching, supporting my YouTube channel, and I'd like to give a special thanks to all of you that follow me and support me on Patreon. God bless you.
Whisper in the sun.